Assalamu alaikum. I am Ahmed Ali Naqvi and you are watching World in Focus. नाज़रीन, आज के इस एपिसोड में हम रिसेंटली जो रशिया यूक्रेन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट के हवाले से एक अपटिक इन डिप्लोमेसी था, उसी हवाले से हमने देखा कि जो कल जो यूएस प्रेसिडेंट हैं उन्होंने अनाउंस किया सैंक्शंस ऑन टू रशियन ऑयल कंपनीज। एक कंपनी जो है वो लुक ऑयल के नाम से है और दूसरी जो है वो रोजनेफ्ट के नाम से है। ये दोनों कंपनीज जो हैं वो स्टेट रन कंपनीज हैं रशिया की, और इन दोनों कंपनीज के ऊपर जो है वो सैंक्शन लगाई हैं यूएस एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ने अंडर ट्रम्प। और सिंस ट्रम्प केम टू पावर इन 2024 उसके बाद से ये पहली सैंक्शंस हैं जो यूएस की तरफ से हमें रशिया के खिलाफ नजर आती हैं। ये सैंक्शंस जो हैं बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट हैं, दे आर ग्लोबली डिबेटेड, नॉट बिकॉज ऑफ द वॉल्यूम ऑफ इम्पैक्ट दैट विल हैव, बट rather the broader change or shift in Trump's approach towards this war। और इसीलिए हम आज की इस एपिसोड में हम बात करेंगे, 3 मेन एस्पेक्ट पे बात करेंगे। हम एक जो डिप्लोमेटिक अपसर्ज है उसके वाले से बात करेंगे। बिसाइड्स दैट हम बात करेंगे कि जो ये सैंक्शंस हैं व्हाई दे आर इम्पोर्टेंट वन। और तीसरा जो इम्पोर्टेंट टॉपिक एस्पेक्ट होगा दैट विल बी व्हाट आर द लिमिट्स ऑफ दीज सैंक्शंस ऑन रशिया। वो या रशिया के ऊपर या जनरली इन सैंक्शंस में व्हाट इज मिसिंग इन इट एंड हाउ दीज सैंक्शंस विल नॉट बी इनफ to end the conflict in Ukraine or broadly for the interest of the United States and the world. Before I go on to explain this US act of imposing sanctions on Russian oil industry, नाज़रीन आपको स्क्रीन में नजर होगा, we are starting different courses, चाहे वो क्रैश कोर्स हो जो कि in next couple of days में start हो रहा है, which will be very important for those who are preparing for interviews as well as KPPMS and the CSS. Besides that, there is a dedicated course on specialized course on current affairs only, and this course will be only covering all important developments of current affairs, चाहे वो डोमेस्टिक हो, रीजनल हो या ग्लोबल हो। और फिर एक comprehensive last batch of current and Pakistan affairs course, starting all of these courses are starting in the coming days, and you can get more details and get yourself registered for these courses on the given numbers. Now coming back to this particular topic, नाज़रीन हम थोड़ा सा इसका ज़रा बैकग्राउंड की बात करूँ तो ये जो सैंक्शंस हैं रशिया के ऊपर यूएस की, ये बहुत सिग्निफिकेंट हैं। बट इसका बैकग्राउंड क्या है, क्या ये अचानक से हुआ? तो ऑब्वियसली इट इज़ नॉट। हम जानते हैं कि जो प्रेसिडेंट बाइडेन जो थे उस वक्त जब यूएस की तरफ से सैंक्शंस लगाई गई थी, डिफरेंट किस्म की सैंक्शन लगाई गई थी रशिया के ऊपर, मेनली बिकॉज ऑफ रशियाज वॉर इन यूक्रेन। बट वो जो सैंक्शंस थी वो sanctions were effective, but they were unable to deter the Russians from continuing their war against Ukraine। और उस हवाले से हमने देखा कि जो रशिया था it was largely undeterred and continued its advancements in Ukraine। Even Europeans imposed some sanctions, but Europeans continued to buy a lot of things from the Russians despite all of the war। और वो sanctions important थी, they did affect Russia, but not to the level कि रशिया was forced to end the war or it was willing to negotiate the end of the war। बट जब डोनाल्ड ट्रंप प्रेसिडेंट बन रहे थे, जब कैंपेन में थे, तो उनकी जो स्टेटेड पोजीशन थी कि व्हेन आई कम टू पावर आई विल एंड द वॉर विद इन 48 आवर्स। बट व्हेन ही वाज अनेबल टू एंड द वॉर विद इन 48 आवर्स, उन्होंने अपना नैरेटिव चेंज किया और उनका आर्गुमेंट ये बना कि इफ आई वर द प्रेसिडेंट, वॉर वुड नेवर हैव स्टार्टेड इन द फर्स्ट प्लेस। Therefore, now that it has started, it has gone complex and requires a lot more effort to end this war। And that's why नाज़रीन डोनाल्ड ट्रंप एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन जो है उनकी तरफ से बहुत सारी एफर्ट्स की गई। he had met with President Putin in Alaska, he had met President Zelensky from Ukraine multiple times, और उनमें से कुछ जो नेगोशिएशन थी वो तो बड़ी एक टेंस भी हुई पब्लिक मीडिया के सामने। Besides that, हमने कहा कि यूरोपियंस के साथ भी एक एंगेजमेंट हुई, but none of these diplomatic overtures by Donald Trump were able to create a potential impact on the end of the war, and the war seems to be continuing। It seems to be a never-ending war despite Trump's efforts। Now, this has led to two things in Trump's mind. One, it has frustrated him because of his failure of different acts, his failure to so far make either end of the war or take a meaningful direction towards the end of the war। Besides that, the second impact was that this had actually created an image that Trump might solve problems with respect to states that are weaker in nature, जैसे इंडिया पाकिस्तान की कॉन्फ्लिक्ट की बात करते हैं, जैसे इसराइल की बात करते हैं। बट फॉर वेयर ग्रेट पावर कम्स रशिया, the United States power has its own limits. So therefore, something that president cannot do has something that has tarnished his image in his view globally. Therefore, I think gradually Trump is coming to a point where he thinks that he has to take some decisive steps. और उसके उसके हवाले से मैंने लिखा कि आज से कुछ दिन पहले Trump tried to pressurize President Zelensky, what in normal language we call the bullying of Zelensky, जिसके हवाले से different magazine जो थे international news outlets थे उन्होंने कहा that even he shouted at Zelensky because he wanted to force Zelensky to accept the Russian demand that the eastern Ukrainian territory of Donbass must be given to Russia. That's the primary demand of President Putin. Ukraine was reluctant, and that not only led to a kind of escalation of words, but also United States backtracking from selling Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, which Ukraine was demanding for so many times. So therefore, this frustration that President Trump has against Zelensky, now it has taken the direction towards Russia. And therefore, it is in this context that President Trump ultimately announced the sanctioning of two state-run Russian oil companies, जिनका नाम है Look Oil and the Rosneft. ये दोनों कंपनीज जो है नाज़रीन ये बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंट हैं. अब इनके ऊपर एनालाइज करते हैं कि ये जो सैंक्शन लगी हैं इसमें ऑब्वियसली बात है जो नेचर ऑफ सैंक्शन है दैट हैज़ येट टू बी डिफाइंड कि ये सेकेंडरी है या टर्शियरी है. But these sanctions actually mean that no company is allowed to enter into negotiation with these and enter into agreement with these ones. They can't buy oil or supply components to these companies. Besides these major companies, उनकी जो subsidies हैं, which are more than 2 dozens, उनके ऊपर भी ये tariff, ये sanctions जो हैं वो apply होती हैं. So aim is to isolate them and not allowing Russia to sell oil globally and get revenues that can be used to sustain the war. Besides that, the objective is that through these sanctions, there will be a pressure on Putin, and he would be forced to negotiate and accede to some of the demands coming from President Trump or coming from the Ukrainian president or Europeans over there. So ये basic objective था जिसके तहत लगी, but for many scholars they appreciate these sanctions, but for many scholars these are not enough. So ये दोनों perspective क्या हैं? सबसे पहले बात करते हैं why these sanctions are important. Now, सबसे पहला point तो they are important because they show a different direction that President Trump's diplomacy taking since his second presidency. Initially, he was very pro-Trump, pro-Putin. He was scolding President Zelensky first publicly and later news was that privately as well. But now that he has imposed sanctions, that's a clear indication that there is some change of heart in President Trump's mind towards Russia's conduct and behavior regarding ending the war over here. And the problem not just lies with Ukraine from Trump's perspective. Now he also believes that problem lies on the part of Russia as well, and therefore this changing strategic thinking of Trump towards this war and toward the end game of this war is first major important and for many quarters a positive development. Second is that this war is likely to affect Russia's economy, mainly because Nazin, we know that तकरीबन 20% of Russia's GDP जो है 1/5 of the GDP it relies on oil. Therefore, any tariffs and sanctions on oil is likely to have more impact on Russia's economy. हम जानते हैं कि यूरोपियन यूनियन जो है उन्होंने ऑलरेडी जो LNG है उसके ऊपर जो है वो एक उसको फेज आउट करने की अनाउंसमेंट किया. They have given the date that they will ultimately stop buying the Russian LNG. That would again drain Russia of important revenues. But ये US की जो sanctions थी they would add on. So individually शायद बहुत impact ना पड़े, but coupled with the European ban on Russian LNG, the cumulative effect is likely to be significant on Russia's economy to sustain this war. Another impact would be, Nazin, that Russia would have one more reason to sit on the table and negotiate. Although Russia so far is willing to negotiate with US, but Putin is not willing to negotiate with Zelensky or Ukraine. Therefore, these sanctions are likely to exert some pressure, and scholars believe that Putin might be giving different public statements right now, giving the statements of defiance, but soon it is likely that he will enter into negotiations directly or most likely indirectly with President Zelensky and with Donald Trump to end this war, because he knows that it is the Trump administration and this period alone which could be the key for Russia to extract maximum benefits on the table. Last but not the least, Nazin, another impact is likely that because of these additional sanctions, there is an additional pressure on the states like India, which is the largest buyer of Russian oil, as well as China. So ये दो जो traditional buyers in Russian oil के, they will face the heat of these sanctions, and therefore it would be a major blow towards these states if they continue to buy the Russian oil. And it is generally believed that the positive impact would be from Ukrainian perspective and from the US perspective, that these states will reduce their import of oil, and there are all indicators so far on the ground that are directing us toward the same idea, that these states will gradually limit the import of Russian oil, which is likely to benefit Ukraine on the table and in the battlefield. बट एट सेम टाइम नाज़रीन, बहुत से स्कॉलर्स ये भी कहते हैं दैट ये जो सैंक्शंस हैं इसकी कुछ लिमिटेशन भी हैं. इट माइट नॉट बी एनफ. So according to them, one of the limits is that historically the US sanctions have never forced, or they have rarely forced any country to change their foreign policy discourse, let alone end the wars. Therefore जो स्टेटमेंट आई प्रेसिडेंट पुतिन की तरफ से इसके रिस्पांस में, और जनरली भी जो हिस्टोरिकल एक्सपीरियंस यही कहता है that sanctions have historically backfired, they have made states position hardened, and therefore increase the possibility of conflict, and they never intend to achieve the objective of forcing your adversary to come to the negotiating table. Iran example is in front of us. There are many other examples that are in front of us where sanctions have not yielded the desired effects. Second limitation is, Nazreen, the actual impact. For many scholars, this is going to affect Russia, but not to the level that it would be a major threat to the Russian economy or Russian war. It will be an added pain, but not a pain that would will determine the policy change in Russia regarding Ukraine or regarding these negotiations. Besides that, Nazim, बहुत से स्कॉलर ये भी कहते हैं that these sanctions do not cover most of the Russian oil exports, and therefore the Russians would continue to get the lifeline, and these sanctions have limit in their own scope and is likely to have an impact but not a major impact. Last but not the least, Nazim, one of the most unintended consequences जिसको again President Trump ने highlight किया अपनी statement के अंदर, President Putin ने highlight किया, and something that is very sensitive to President Trump is the obviously बात है जब sanctions होंगी, Russian oil would not be supplied in the international market, therefore the prices are likely to rise. Already 5% rise हो चुका हुआ है अभी तक, और ये oil prices increase करेंगी, causing more inflation in the US, something that has been the sensitive point for President Trump since he came to power this year in January. So to conclude, नाज़रीन, हम कह सकते हैं that these sanctions on Russia at best are likely to indicate a changing behavior, a changing posture of Donald Trump towards this war, and is therefore a welcome development on the part of the Europeans as well as Ukraine. But considering the history of Donald Trump, are these sanctions they are going to sustain? Are these sanctions will not be bypassed through some other incentives to President Putin, चाहे वो political incentive हो या कोई और incentive हो? Scholars believe that sooner or later President Trump will again take a U-turn, and he is likely to give more concessions to President Putin, because in the battle between democracy and authoritarianism, Trump's preference has always been authoritarianism. Thank you so much, Nazim, for watching this program. Kindly like this video, share it, and subscribe this channel. Allah Hafiz.